Hi everyone, bienvenue und Tag auch. I'm sure you're all thrilled to discuss Chapter 10, Measuring Macroeconomic Variables and Policy Issues. And in fact, this chapter is really macro. It's big. A lot of topics. If we look at the table of contents, we see the four parts of economic policy: gross domestic product and the growth that we already have been discussing. We're going a bit deeper today: inflation, unemployment, and the balance of payment, measuring the imports and exports, the relation of the country we're looking from to the rest of the world, plus a very brief outlook towards macroeconomic policies. And when you check our Miro board, you will see that it's also really large. Normally we fill 2 or 3 frames, and here you can see frame 1 to 3 about GDP, 4, 5 about inflation, 6, 7 about unemployment, and then 2, 1 about the balance of payments and macroeconomic policy. The balance of payments is relatively short, as the next chapter, chapter 11, is going to talk about international relations, forex markets, and balance of payments. So we don't go into many details here in this chapter 10. But let's enjoy our overview tour. And even before we start, let's think about these 4 issues that we just mentioned and put them into a geometric form like this. The targets of economic policy are often shown like this, with the 4 basic issues in economic policy at the edges of this geometrical form. GDP growth typically at the top, being the one indicator that is most observed, most discussed and analyzed. Stable prices or low inflation, high employment or low unemployment, obviously, and the international trade. So we have these 4 targets of economic policy. And as we are in Germany, I want you to think about or to research, how do we call this construct in Germany? And in fact, we refer to this geometric form here, and we give it a specific name. That's number 1. But number 2, in Germany, in fact, these 4 targets of economic policy have a specific rank because they are also in a law, in one of the foundation laws of the German economic constitution, we could say. We're not going to talk about this now more intensively. This is a task for you in class, but please keep this in mind. That would be the step 1 before we start talking about the different measurement concepts. Chapter 10, we read the title, we read the different parts of the table of contents. We don't have to do this, and there is some introductory theory, the learning outcomes, how to measure what are the different measures of GDP, of growth, inflation, unemployment, and perhaps a bit the Phillips curve, the balance of payment problems. What does this mean for businesses, and what are these targets? This is exactly now the geometrical form that I just showed you. What do we call these 4 targets of economic policy in Germany? 10.2, the GDP. We have been talking about the GDP last chapter, so also this is a reminder. And please keep in mind, or try to say, okay, what was the difference between these 2? When we have on the one hand this ups and downs, they might be cyclical. We talked about cyclical ups and downs. Here there are more, you have these cyclical, but you have the huge crises in here. You have the financial crisis, because the figure already ends 2015. This is from an older edition. But here you have current figures. And by the way, this is something especially about this chapter. We, of course, refer to the figures of the real economy, but this video is at least meant to be used for some years. So next year, year after this, and so on, the numbers will not be current any longer, which means that it's your task and our task together to, every time we discuss this, every time we come to these issues here, that we update the figures, that we ask ourselves, okay, is this different from what Peter had in the video, what Peter discussed? What is the current, what is our today's situation? Did it improve? Did it stay the same, or did it perhaps get worse? Were there more external shocks like we observed some in the last years? So keep this in mind. And the question again, what is the difference? What is this indicator that goes cyclically up and down? Whereas on the other hand, what kind of measurement do we have that basically goes up all the time here over a period of 30 years, around 30 years, always going up? What was the difference between? What do we measure up there? What do we measure down there? Question mark. Think about it. Answer in class. The first issue of measurement, it says here, based on the circular flow of income, we can measure GDP using, and now we will see, okay, on the one hand, different concepts. This figure 10.2 of our book, and you can go there to the respective page and you will find text, of course, that explains, that goes a bit deeper into this. That's number one, the different concepts. How do we measure? And number two, three different approaches: the net value approach, the expenditure approach, and the income approach. Let's see what this holds. These three graphs fill our first frame. And yeah, now we might ask ourselves, okay, what is this about? We have the different definitions, and you might have come across some of these definitions: gross national product versus gross domestic product, so national versus domestic. For the Germans who heard about the concepts, they used to be called differently because before they were harmonized by the European Union. In German, originally, we talked about the Bruttosozialprodukt, and you might know this from the song, and the Bruttoinlandsprodukt. The Bruttosozialprodukt used to be for many decades the reference point, and then was changed to Bruttoinlandsprodukt. So the gross domestic product is today what we measure all over Europe, mostly in the world. The gross national product is a difference. And when we look at this, we can see in the first two columns that we have on the one hand the GNP, the gross national product, and this is opposed to the GDP, the gross domestic product, that is named here on the right-hand side GDP, but we already know how to compute the GDP: consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net export. So this is GDP. That's why the two columns are equal here. And we also see that the difference between the two, between GNP and GDP, is the net property income from abroad. And that's in fact what we compute. That's the difference that we typically make. In the gross national product, we want to measure the income of everyone, all the people and firms who are registered within that country. Whereas the gross domestic product measures everything that is produced, or the values that are produced within the country's boundaries. You might recall our definition of GDP: the value of all final goods and services produced within a country's boundaries in a given period of time. And that is the difference, and that's why we have sort of one rule, or we can derive one rule of computation. Up here, which is that one, a domestic product plus the net income from abroad is the national product. And you might think about someone living, as we are here in Bremen, northern Germany, living here in the region, but working in the neighbor country, working in the Netherlands, in Groningen. The value that this person produces will be counted in the gross domestic product of the Netherlands, because it takes place physically in the Netherlands, but it will be counted in the gross national product of Germany if this person lives in Germany, is registered here with the address. And that's already the difference. So for private people, it's more like commuting over a border, or the question, where do you work and where are you registered? For firms, that might be a bit more, but in fact, the difference between GNP and GDP is not that big, at least percentage-wise. So that was our first difference, and we can see this here between GDP and GNP. So what is in between is the net income from abroad. And this is also how the rest of this formula of the graphs and so on work. The first formula says a gross product minus depreciation is the net product, and this is what we have here as a definition. Gross minus depreciation is net. You can check the definition of depreciation. Another word is capital consumption. So when a machine or any production factor is used over time, it will lose its value, and at some time it will not be possible to produce anything with this, and it's what we call
depreciation.
So gross minus depreciation is net, and that would go in this direction. Gross domestic product minus depreciation is net domestic product. Gross national product minus depreciation gives me the net national product. Last way of computing here, the third row, is about the state balance, SB. We could abbreviate indirect taxes and subsidies. And we see the definition here: product plus state balance is an income. And this is a crucial distinction, because when we talk about GDP as a proxy for national income, we have to keep in mind that production, first of all, is the value of the goods and services. That doesn't mean that it ends up in our pockets, that it's at the end our income. But there are different things that are deducted but also added. And as an example here, you have the indirect taxes that we have to pay on the one hand. So there is production, but before we get this, when we buy them, we have to pay indirect taxes. And this goes to the government, it sort of goes away. On the other hand, the government pays transfer payments to households and subsidies to firms, and both are meant here. And this is called the state balance. And after you do this, you come to the income, and especially when we go down here, the NNI, the national income. And that's also why the whole graph is called from GDP to national income. From the measurement of production, the value of all final goods and services produced, to income, what hopefully ends up in our pockets. And there's one more distinction that we in fact make here. When we come from this national income, when we measure this national income, only a part again of this are wages and salaries, and that's income from labor, we could say. Whereas the rest comes from other production factors. Recall the production factors: labor, land, and capital. So the rental income obviously comes from the production factor land, and the capital and the profits and income from self-employment, dividends, and so on come from the production factor capital. And let's keep this in mind when we think about the income measure, the income approach, because this was what we call different concepts. Please feel free to try a bit whether you understand these different computations, the definitions. These are, of course, definitions. You might be asked, what is the difference between gross domestic product and net domestic product, and so on. and you should be aware, you should have an idea where this comes from and why we measure it like this. From slide 7, where we had here these 3 approaches, the net value or production approach, the expenditure approach, and the income approach. There are 2 names because our book uses the bold ones, and the Statistical Bureau of Germany, das Statistische Bundesamt, uses these, production, use, and distribution. And as we want to have a look at German numbers, we need to look at both of them. This is slide 7, and on slide 9 we have a bit more background information, and let's put this into Miro. Okay, here again you have the 3 approaches, and we could say the first one is the one that we already know. We have been talking about this in chapter 9. We defined it with the help of the circular flow of income. So in fact, this is what we know: consumption plus income plus government expenditure plus net exports. The second one is the very example that we have been looking at a minute ago, because it's looking at the income. So what is it that at the end finds the way into our pockets? And that's the salaries, and we could repeat salaries from labor, profit from capital income, and rent income from land owning. This is not 100% correct, because here it says equals gross domestic product, and we know from the last slide, no, it's national income, so a bit less than gross domestic product, what ends up as national income. Now, the value-added approach: net output after deducting goods and services used during the production process. And we chose the example here, our daily bread give us today, but who does give us our daily bread, and what is sort of the result in the prices? And I'd like to again give you this task in our book. There is an example about this way of computing, and you might find the problem of double counting. It's on the one hand similar to this example, and on the other hand not. The farmer produces wheat and sells it for €1 to the miller. The miller makes flour from the wheat and sells it for €2 to the baker. The baker uses the flour in order to make bread, and we are the ones who have to pay €3.20, although the original value of the wheat was €1, wasn't it? So that's another approach where we want to ask ourselves, what is measured here? And you can already see the highlighted word, value added. We know this, value added. We have a value added tax. But how does this go together with our measurement principles here? So that's another task that we take from here into our classroom in order to fill the theoretical ideas that we discuss here with live and with everyday numbers. One type of measurement comes from a publication of the German Statistical Bureau, Die Statis, and it was called National Accounts at a Glance. It was called because the German Statistische Bundesamt, in its eternal wisdom, decided that it's no longer necessary to publish these numbers in English, because, I don't know why, I don't have the eternal wisdom of the Statistische Bundesamt, but whatever. That's why 2022 are the most current numbers that we get. And since then, we have to take the German equivalent from this. It's called Wichtige Zusammenhänge im Überblick. And the most current one is are the numbers for 2024, published in 25. Also this, I just found, surprised on the webpage, will be the last numbers that the Statistische Bundesamt publishes in this way, because obviously they do no longer want to do the work they are paid for, but they want us, the consumers, the users of their data, do the work here. We have to then go into databases and so on. But at the moment, the idea is that you have a look at what do we measure here. And if we think about the expenditure approach that we already said the Statistische Bundesamt calls use approach, we have on the one hand the final consumption. We have the consumption of the households and we have the consumption of the government. Bit strange definition, but per definition, everything that the government uses as means, even if it pays civil servants, even if it builds a university, is defined as consumption. Whereas gross capital formation, you might recall that term, is what we call investment. And we have the balance of exports and imports. So exports, imports, and here we have the net exports. Also here, think a bit about the numbers. We said, okay, on the one hand, the net exports is not a huge part of GDP if we look percentage-wise. But if you look at the original numbers, the exports themselves and the imports themselves, there is quite a difference. And now, of course, it's you again. This is the number of the gross domestic product for 2022. And what about today? Don't miss the fun of checking the data, finding the data online, comparing the values and comparing the relations that you find there, and discussing this in class. Another measurement issue, GDP measurement per capita. And we have the definition in our book. I copied it here from the book. Per capita is the GDP for the economy divided by the population of this economy. GDP per capita provides a measure of average income per person. Now that will be again an issue to be discussed. What does average mean? And does average measure equality? Because we might recall that our target is still maximizing welfare, and maximizing welfare was allocating efficiently to produce as many as possible of the desired goods and services and distributing fairly. Do we measure here something like fair or equal distribution? Have a look at the countries. The country with the highest, with the by far highest GDP per capita is Luxembourg. Check where the United States, where other European countries are, where the UK is, where Germany is, and so on. And do you have a feeling that this really reflects welfare, well-being, or things like this? And when you look at the whole world and you get a picture like this, what at the end does this number of GDP per capita, which is definitely better than GDP without taking into account how many people live there, but GDP per capita, what does this number tell us? The next question mark, the next thing to be discussed in class. Other aspects of measuring welfare via the growth of GDP are mentioned here. Aspects of social well-being, for example, social costs. A review of the happiness index. I hope you recall our discussion at the end of semester 1, where we looked at alternative approaches, and we already then asked ourselves, okay, is GDP and GDP growth really an appropriate way of measuring economic activity? We put a question mark to this, but on the other hand, we all do. The world economy does, the governments do, and so on. So we have to discuss the way we deal with GDP. Also, this figure 10.7 will remind you of what we did last week, because there we discussed these booms and recessions and so on. And you can see here that there might be a trade-off between an increase in aggregate demand that we have here that comes with inflation. Inflation as the price of growth. That's something we also have to discuss in chapters 13 and the following. But what is inflation? That leads us to the second part of this chapter, inflation, measuring how fast prices are rising. We quickly mention at the beginning the difference between demand pull and cost push inflation. But this original definition, how fast are prices rising, with this cartoon here, think about the term, think about the word inflate. You inflate a balloon, you inflate a ball, you inflate a tire at your bicycle or at your car. You just put air in, it becomes bigger. And that's exactly what inflation does. If prices rise, then everything seems bigger, but it isn't. We might have 10% more income, but if prices went up by 20% in that time, although our income looks bigger, in fact, it's smaller. So what we have to do, we have to deflate. We have to make sure that we can compute the inflation, the price increase factor, out of our equation. We come to this later, but keep it in mind that inflation is about making things bigger, making things seem bigger than they in fact are. Demand pull and cost push are relations that have to do or that go in direction of our microeconomic analyses, the graphs that we just looked at. If there is an increase in demand, there are more people coming into the country, or there is the government increasing aggregate demand by spending more, that might or that will, according to the ADAS, aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, lead to inflation. And we call this demand pull because it was the demand that pulled on the market, that increased the demand, and that led to not only a higher national output, but also inflation. Cost push then obviously is the opposite. That happens if there are higher costs, and due to the higher cost, the aggregate supply becomes smaller. So firms are no longer willing at a specific price to produce things, but produce, at least some firms, but produce less. So a left shift of the aggregate supply curve brings us to what is called cost push inflation. Think about examples. In the last years, we unfortunately had good examples for this, good examples in the sense of that we could really see what happened there. Think about the COVID-19 pandemic and what happened in that time. Think about the Russian aggression, the war when Russia attacked Ukraine. What happened with prices and why did that happen? And bring this together with cost push and demand pull inflation. When it comes to inflation, expectations play a crucial role, because whatever we expect prices to do, prices are going to do this. If we, the people, a majority of the consumers, think that prices are going to rise, we are going to react. Inflation becomes self-fulfilling. If there was a newspaper article saying prices are going to increase, people beware, then without any reason, economic reason, the prices are going to increase. Because, the example here, individuals expect 2% inflation, they are going to demand increases on the one hand in wages, and that will bring up the costs so that the firms at the end have to increase prices. But also they might prepone purchases. We might buy things earlier. We might say, okay, we wanted to buy a new car in 2 years, but now we expect that it will be more expensive in 2 years. Let's buy it now. If everybody does this, there is a demand pull inflation, because there's more demand. This pulls prices up And that's why expectations are important and in fact dangerous here. Or let's say they can be dangerous. It's important to keep inflation in expectations in mind. It's important to keep the public informed and let us, all the consumers know there is no inflation coming, then we behave in a rational way. But expectations can be self-fulfilling. That's an important message for policymakers. So we already talked about inflation that makes a balloon or a tire bigger. Deflation is the opposite. If you have a deflation problem or deflation in your tire, at your car, at your bicycle, then you have a problem because you won't be able to use that means of transportation. This is sort of the different definition of inflation and deflation. And there's something like a deflator. So if we compare things over time, if we compare the development of GDP over time, what we just did, it's the real GDP. We usually not compare the nominal numbers of GDP, which increased substantially, but we say, okay, that's not what is of our interest. It's not the price tax itself. This cost 110 years ago, and now it costs 180. But which were the prices? How did the prices increase? And then we subtract the prices. This is what it says here. When prices are compared over time, they need to be adjusted for inflation and be converted into constant prices. Or when a GDP is observed over time, then it's this what we have to observe, the real numbers that are deflated, that are controlled for inflation. Bringing us to the measurement of inflation. What is inflation? How do we measure it? On page 257, our book gives the short definition. The rate of inflation is a measure of how fast prices are rising. Okay, let's take this as a definition and ask ourselves, okay, but how do we measure this? Here, I'd like to go towards the German numbers. For example, a household expenditure survey can be something. And the development of a price index based on the prices of the basket. The basket of goods is what we typically refer to, and a basket means the average amount of goods that we typically buy, the average content of a shopping basket that we have, but of course not when we go shopping once, but what do we buy typically in a month? How much milk, how many books, how many loaves of bread, how much cheese, and all this is in the basket, and not only food, but other things. We're going to have a look at the basket in a minute. And a price index is made out of this. So our task now is to understand what is a price index and what is inflation. How is a price index related to inflation? How can we compute the inflation from the price index? Getting numbers for Germany, the best way is in fact to go to the Statis, the Deutsche Statistische Bundesamt, and just enter something like prices. You will end up at this landing page. There's also a link down here that brings you to this page where we talk about the price index. And you will find a current number there, and this number is with a relatively high probability different from the one you see here. This is from end of September. In fact, today is the 10th of October, 2025, and we have an inflation rate of 2.4%, where the consumer prices for energy are negative. We have a deflation there. Energy is cheaper, but the consumer prices for food are more expensive. So we have to look at different prices, and that is what we called the basket, which part of our monthly expenditure do we spend on energy? Which percentage do we spend on food? What are the big parts of our shopping basket? When you go down here, you find current news and so on, notable price changes in the last month. You find tables, consumer price indices, and here we can look at the price index overall, or by the divisions where we look down into food, housing, transportation, and so on. There are databases and so on, the price monitor. We are going to open some of these. One is the price kaleidoscope, because this one is the, from my point of view, very good and very creative way of the De Statis to visualize the basket of goods. What is in our basket, and what can we learn from this? Let's start with the numbers. We want to know something about consumer prices, the consumer price index overall on a monthly level. We want to see what we find there. And here, as I said, that will be different when you look at these numbers, but you have the possibility to look at the current numbers every time. And it says for August 2024, the consumer price index is 122.3. What is that about? For food, it's 136. For clothing, it's 106, and so on. And all this is based on 2020 equals 100. What is that? What do we learn from this? I'd like you to prepare, especially this part, for our class discussion. Make sure you have an idea when you come. What does that mean? 2020 is 100 or equals 100. What can we do with this? And also the difference between a price index, that's what we had here, and then it says here changes on previous month, changes on the month of the year before. There we get totally different numbers. It's not 100 something, but it's 2.2, 2.0. What is this that we are looking at? On the next slide, I put the two next to each other, so you can see here for the same month the index as well as the rates that we look here. And a task is number one, the most important task, to understand what we see here and what we can do with this. And number two, find the current numbers for your country. First of all, for Germany, but we might, depending on how much time we invest in this, we might say, okay, different teams do different countries and so on. Why not compute this missing column? Yeah, you see here alcoholic beverages have these numbers, and then there is the number here missing. How can we compute this? Is that possible with the numbers I gave you, or do you need others? These are topics to be discussed again in class. And of course, back to this price kaleidoscope, there is a link behind it. So if you click on the link, the page with this kaleidoscope is going to open. There is some explanation, and if you go to the kaleidoscope itself, you find the current one here, August 2024, where the inflation rate was 2.2. You can see that there are some explanations here, and when I go there, the parts of the pie of our expenditure are highlighted. I can go the other way around. I can go in here and mouse over, and I see information about the weight and the price change. So still the same question. What is this about? Make sure that you really get an idea, so that we can sort of enjoy this colorful economic illustration of inflation. So much for inflation. We already talked about the deflator, what it is and what we use it for. Inflation has, in fact, costs for the economy. That's why a government should make sure to avoid inflation, and in fact not the government but the central bank. There are reasons to target inflation. Bringing us to part 4 and the third of our 4 indicators, unemployment. A number here, you have the number down there in figure 10.12 from our book, and a relatively current 9th October 2025. The development you can see here of the ILO, the International Labour Organization. Yeah, again, the question, what is depicted here? And there's the link, you can go there to the data. And yeah, the question, what can we learn from this? And what are the important issues from an economic point of view? Before digging into numbers and comparing numbers, we have to understand what unemployment actually is, what the unemployment rate actually is. So let's write it down. Think for a moment, unemployment rate. How would you define unemployment rate? Which numbers do you need in order to compute the unemployment rate? I suppose we have the idea the number of unemployed is an important variable. But what is the reference? At the end here, we talk about the denominator. The number of unemployed is in the numerator, and by what do we have to divide this? The answer is it's the labor force. It's all the people in a country that are able to work, which I suppose makes sense, but you have sort of the number of unemployed in both the numerator and the denominator. And both together, the number of employed and the number of unemployed is what we call the labor force, the number of people who are able to work, who can work, who are in the respective age, and so on. And then the numerator is a part of the denominator, and it is at the end a percentage. So that's our definition. And then there's this other term, the claimant. Claimants are those who go to the unemployment authority and claim that they are unemployed and claim that they are eligible for unemployment benefits. So people actively going to the, in German, Job Center or Bundesagentur für Arbeit. And this, you see, a description here, claimant statistics understate the level of unemployment as many people are ineligible, are not eligible to claim unemployment. And you might think for a moment which people who is not able to claim unemployment. And you will find quite a lot of people, those who are too young, who have never worked and are not registered, who go to school, go to university partly, if they didn't work before. Other parts of the population who never worked in a job where they had to contribute to social security, doing housework and so on, are not counted in such a statistic. People who are self-employed, so who have their own enterprise and so on, also in Germany are not counted into the Arbeitslosenversicherung, because they cannot go to the Bundesagentur für Arbeit or to the job center and say, hey, I'm unemployed. Also guys like me, public servants, because we are not a part of the system. So quite a huge number of people is not counted in this. And that's why there is also another statistic in Germany. The Bundesagentur für Arbeit publishes the Arbeitslosenstatistik. And when we translate this to English, it's the unemployment. Also, the other term published by the Statistische Bundesamt, by des Staates, Erwerbslosenstatistik. In English translation, both of them would be unemployment rates or unemployment statistics. The difference between the two is that the Arbeitslosenstatistik by the Bundesagentur is based on claimants, whereas the Erwerbslosenstatistik, computed by the Statistische Bundesamt, is based on surveys. So they ask a huge number of people on a regular basis, do you work, do you want to work? And with this, they find out who is unemployed. The both statistics, of course, know each other, work with each other, use each other to correct the results. And in reality, the two results are relatively close to each other, but not because they are the same, but because they use each other in order to correct things. The ILO, the International Labour Office, I already asked about this before, is a UN, one part of the United Nations, a UN organization that is responsible for labor affairs, that sets international labor standards, and that also defines how to measure unemployment so that unemployment statistics can be compared between different countries. So much for this formal definition. Another type of definition is frictional, cyclical, structural, as a definition that, on the one hand, where we could say frictional, change of jobs, you are unemployed for a short period of time, cyclical, concerning the business cycle, the cyclical ups and downs of economic activity, or the seasonal ups and downs. We know there are a lot of jobs where people can only work in the summer and are laid off in the winter and so on. So these are temporary unemployment spells. Whereas when it comes to structural unemployment, this is often more the long-term issue, and so much more of a problem. The economic structure, if there are not enough jobs in the current industries, the industries that are important at the moment, then a country might have a structural problem, and that is something that you don't want to have, and that is a big challenge to the policymakers. Classical unemployment is sort of a totally different thing here. It describes unemployment that is based on the economic model, the classical supply and demand model. Theory-based, and that's the point where we in fact come to a first discussion of economic theory. Classical. Please recall from our start in economics, from Economics 1, the classical theory. The classical or neoliberal theory is the theory that believes in markets, in the self-adjusting properties and powers of markets, and basically neglects or says that the government should play a really small role. In the typical example that we can apply the classical unemployment is to say if there is something like a natural or whatever equilibrium at a price of £8, but an institution, and that could be a government or whatever, fixes a minimum price or a minimum wage of 10. The expectation is from the model, and this is exactly what we learned in microeconomics, that we come to this situation. There is so much demand, and demand, recall, these are the firms, and there is so much supply by the workers, and we have a name for this, which is called a surplus. And we learned that in a surplus, the smaller number is going to be realized. So there will not be 1,500 people employed, which would be the equilibrium, but there will only be 1,000 people employed. This is the argument of conservative, of liberal economists. And I want you to think about this as well, and think about minimum wage in Germany. So please think about it, and some hints. When was the minimum wage introduced in Germany? Do we have this for many decades, or when was that? Why? Why is the biggest question here. Will be not that easy to find, but let us keep this in mind and discuss. Did it lead to increased unemployment? Because this would be the implication of the theory. If the theory is correct, then a minimum wage leads to less people being employed and leads to unemployment. Did that happen in that time? I'm sure you find sources for this. Discuss the macroeconomic implications. And one thing that we are going to learn here is that when we take a micro model like this, and this is a model, as we said, from microeconomics, and apply it on a macro level and say, okay, if this happens on all small markets, then it will happen in the economy as well. Is that a good idea, or might there be issues, might there be problems? So I'm looking forward to discussing unemployment and especially this part with you. Policy issues especially talk about a wasted resource. Unemployment means that not all people who want to work do work, and primarily this means that no goods or services are produced by these people. In a second step, that means if you are in a social market economy, there typically is a social security, and the society has to pay for these people. Increased stress and poor health, and the Phillips curve. We're not going to discuss the Phillips curve here. Please recall, partly we discussed it in Economics 1. What does that mean between the trade-off, unemployment and inflation? Bringing us towards the end, the last but first point, balance of payment. And I already said here we really just briefly mention the balance of payment that is made up from different accounts. It has a current account, a capital account, a financial account, and it measures a country's net position with the rest of the world, where it measures flows in goods and services. And that's one thing we have to discuss. You see here, chapter 10. Yeah? It's not the topic, it's not the time now to discuss the balance of payment intensively, but the idea is to just have a first idea. It measures the country's net position with the rest of the world. But this term, measuring flows in goods and services, the balance of payment measures flows. Please think about what is a balance. If we think about the balance sheet of a firm, does it measure the flows, the cash flow, for example, or the profits and loss and so on? Is this measured in a balance sheet? Question mark. A question for chapter 11. Chapter 11. I'm sorry, it's of course not chapter 10. A question for chapter 11, but it's first idea to go there. There are some policy issues here that have to be discussed. Is it bad to have a negative balance of payment? Short run, long run issues. But that's enough for part 10.5 for the balance of payments here. And with this, we enter the last subchapter, 10.6, macroeconomic policy, which is only this one slide, as it just opens an idea, as we had with several points here, to open up our mind for macroeconomics, to be aware what are the different indicators before we then in the following chapters go deeper into these issues. The same for macroeconomic policy, basically a definition here. On the one hand, we differentiate between the demand side and supply side, or demand side policies and supply side policies, where the supply side talks about the active intervention, the active economic policy of governments, and we already saw that can have to do with demand of the government itself, when we have this definition C plus I plus G, government plus net exports. Then there can be active policy, whereas the supply side is about supporting the firms, giving them the background, lowering taxes and so on, in order to make the market and make the private actors in the market act in the direction of positive economic development. Fiscal policy is everything that the government does with government expenditures on the one hand, but on the other hand also taxes with which it finances the expenditures or credits that it takes. And highlighting government means obviously fiscal policies done by the government, whereas monetary policy is performed by a central bank. And this central bank should be independent. An independent central bank where there is no government and no other institutions in the background that can say, hey, do this, hey, do that. And we have quite some examples in history, in politics, perhaps politics of today. Think of developments in the world where governments struggle with central banks in order to lift the independence and tell the central banks what to do. So it's central banks, and it's typically about the amount of money in circulation, regulated frequently via the interest rate, the leading interest rate. And with this basic definition, or very superficial definition of what are the different types of economic policies that we are going to discuss, especially in chapters 13 and 14, we end our overview chapter 10. Thank you very much that you had the patience and you followed this video. I'm aware that there are quite a lot of issues raised, there are quite a lot of terms, and you go home with question marks that I made. You might have your own question marks. And the idea is that in class, what we do, we really focus on the questions. We really focus on what can we do with this information that is gathered, that is assembled and more or less pressed into this chapter 10. Why does it help us to understand the macroeconomy? And why do we, or you as management students, need to know this? What is important for us? Why is it important for us to understand macroeconomics, to make wise decisions, wise management decisions, wise business decisions? Looking forward to talking about this. Have a nice day and see you in class and in the next video.